Operation Ryan had a fundamental flaw. KGB agents were ordered to find evidence of American attack preparations, monitor blood bank stocks, count lights in government buildings, track activity at military bases. But the question was wrong. They were not asking whether America was planning an attack. They were asking whether America was prepared to attack. The answer would always be yes, because America was always prepared. Nuclear deterrence required it. Missiles were always locked on targets. Bombers were always on standby. Submarines were always on patrol. KGB agents found evidence of preparation, because preparation was real, but it did not mean intent to attack. When you ask the wrong question, even the right answer can be dangerous. Ryan made Moscow increasingly paranoid, and that paranoia nearly destroyed the world in November 1983. This is the story of the largest intelligence-gathering operation of the Cold War, how asking the wrong question led to the wrong conclusions, and how the Soviet Union convinced itself that nuclear war was imminent when it was not. The fear began at the top. Yuri Andropov became head of the KGB in 1967. For 15 years, he ran Soviet intelligence with an iron hand. He knew every secret, every operation, every threat. And he was convinced that the West wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. This was not entirely irrational. The Cold War was real. NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced each other across Europe with massive armies. Thousands of nuclear weapons stood ready on both sides. The possibility of war was genuine. But Andropov's fear went deeper than strategic calculation. It was personal. It was visceral. It shaped his worldview completely. In 1956, Andropov was Soviet ambassador to Hungary when the Hungarian Revolution erupted. He watched as crowds demanded freedom. He saw the threat to Soviet control. He called for tanks. The Soviet military crushed the uprising. Thousands died. Andropov was there for all of it. That experience convinced him that the West was always working to undermine communist rule. Every reform movement was Western manipulation. Every sign of discontent was foreign interference. The enemy never rested. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, Andropov saw confirmation of everything he feared. Ronald Reagan transformed American foreign policy. The previous decade had seen détente, arms control agreements, cultural exchanges, a softening of Cold War tensions. Both sides seemed to accept that coexistence was necessary. Reagan rejected this approach. He believed the Soviet Union was evil and had to be confronted. He called it the evil empire. He announced a massive military buildup. He proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system that critics called Star Wars. To Americans, this was tough rhetoric designed to negotiate from strength. Reagan believed that pressuring the Soviets would eventually lead to better deals. He was not planning to start a war, but Moscow heard something different. Soviet leaders heard a president calling their country evil. They saw military spending increasing dramatically. They watched as new missiles were deployed in Europe. They heard talk of fighting and winning a nuclear war. To Andropov, this looked like preparation for attack. In May 1981, he addressed a closed session of KGB officers. He told them that the United States was preparing for nuclear war. The Soviet Union must not be caught by surprise. Intelligence gathering must be intensified. Operation Ryan was born. Ryan was the largest peacetime intelligence operation in Soviet history. The name was a Russian acronym, Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, nuclear missile attack. Its purpose was to detect preparations for an American first strike. Every KGB station around the world received instructions. They were to monitor specific indicators that might signal attack. Preparations. The list was detailed and comprehensive. Watch blood banks. An attack would require stockpiling blood for casualties. Increased donations might indicate preparation. Monitor government buildings at night. If lights stayed on late, It might mean crisis planning. Count the windows, track the patterns, observe military bases, increased activity, unusual movements, changes in routine. All might indicate preparation for war. Track the movements of key officials. If political and military leaders began evacuating to bunkers, attack might be imminent. Watch for civil defense preparations, drills, shelter construction, emergency supply distribution, all potential indicators. The instructions went to KGB stations in Washington, London, Paris, Bonn, Tokyo, and dozens of other cities. Thousands of agents were tasked with gathering this intelligence. It was an enormous undertaking, but it was built on a flawed foundation. The problem with Ryan was fundamental. The operation asked agents to find evidence of attack preparation. This meant looking for signs that military and civilian infrastructure was ready for war. But nuclear deterrence required constant readiness. That was the entire point. Both superpowers maintained forces that could launch at any moment. Both had plans for nuclear war. Both conducted exercises. Both maintained civil defense programs. When KGB agents looked for evidence of preparation, they found it. Because it was real. America was prepared for nuclear war. It had been prepared since the 1950s. The missiles were armed. The bombers were fueled. The submarines were deployed. None of this indicated intent to attack. It was the normal state of nuclear deterrence. But Ryan did not ask about intent. It asked about capability and preparation. This created a confirmation bias on a massive scale. Agents were told what to look for. They found it. Their reports confirmed the original hypothesis. The hypothesis became more entrenched. Search intensified. Each piece of evidence reinforced the conclusion. The conclusion demanded more evidence. The cycle fed on itself. Moscow became increasingly convinced that attack was coming, not because the evidence showed intent, but because the evidence showed preparation. And preparation was constant. Ryan created a dangerous feedback loop. As Soviet fears increased, Soviet behavior changed. Military forces were put on higher alert. Intelligence gathering intensified. Diplomatic communications became more suspicious. American intelligence noticed these changes. They saw increased Soviet military activity. They detected heightened KGB operations. They observed Soviet diplomats asking strange questions about civil defense and blood banks. This concerned American analysts. Why were the Soviets acting this way? What did they know that America did not? Was something happening? The American response was to increase vigilance, more reconnaissance flights, enhanced monitoring of Soviet forces, stepped up intelligence operations. Soviet intelligence noticed these American responses. They interpreted them as further evidence of attack preparation. The Americans were watching more closely. They were gathering more intelligence. They must be planning something. Each side's response to the other's behavior confirmed the other's fears. The feedback loop accelerated. Tensions rose without either side fully understanding why. This was the danger of Ryan. It did not just misread American intentions. It created a dynamic where misreading became self-reinforcing. Fear bred behavior that bred more fear. By 1983, Soviet leadership was genuinely frightened. They believed that nuclear war was not just possible, but probable. They were watching for the first signs of attack. And then Able Archer began. Able Archer was an annual NATO exercise. It simulated the command and control procedures for nuclear war. Staff officers practiced the decision-making process that would occur if conventional war in Europe escalated to nuclear conflict. In 1983, Able Archer was more realistic than previous years. The scenario involved a progression from conventional to nuclear warfare. Message formats closely resembled actual war orders. Some versions of the exercise included roles for heads of government. NATO did not think this was unusual. They were testing their systems. They wanted to be sure that in a real crisis, command and control would function properly. It was prudent military planning. Soviet intelligence saw something else entirely. KGB stations reported unusual activity at NATO headquarters. Communication patterns changed. The exercise looked different from previous years. It seemed more serious, more realistic. Ryan agents had been watching for signs of attack preparation for over 2 years. They were primed to see threats everywhere. Able Archer looked exactly like what they had been warned about. Reports flooded into Moscow. NATO was simulating nuclear war. But was it simulation or preparation? Was the exercise cover for an actual attack? Soviet leadership took the threat seriously, very seriously. The Soviet response to Able Archer was alarming. Nuclear-armed aircraft in East Germany and Poland were placed on alert. Pilots sat in cockpits, ready to launch on short notice. This was not normal. It was expensive and dangerous. It signaled genuine concern. Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles were readied. The SS-20s that NATO feared were prepared for potential use. Launch crews were briefed. Intelligence gathering intensified further. Every KGB station was ordered to report any sign of attack preparation. The flow of reports to Moscow became a flood. Within the Soviet military command, there was genuine debate. Was this the real thing? Should they prepare a preemptive strike? If America was about to attack, waiting would be suicidal. We do not know exactly how close the Soviet Union came to launching. The records are still classified, but subsequent accounts from Soviet officials confirmed that the danger was real. Some in the leadership genuinely believed that nuclear war might begin at any moment. The situation was more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis in at least one respect. During the Cuban crisis, both sides knew they were in a confrontation. Leaders communicated directly. There were clear steps toward resolution. During Able Archer, the danger was invisible. NATO had no idea the Soviets were reacting this way. There was no hotline call, no ultimatum, no visible crisis, just a training exercise on one side and near panic on the other. One man understood what was happening. Oleg Gordievsky was a KGB officer stationed in London. He was also secretly working for British intelligence, MI6. For years, he had been providing the West with invaluable information about Soviet operations. Gordievsky saw the Ryan reports. He read the frantic messages from Moscow, understood that Soviet leadership genuinely believed attack was imminent. He reported this to his MI6 handlers. The British were alarmed. They passed the information to Washington. American officials were stunned. They had no idea the Soviets were this frightened. Reagan's tough rhetoric was meant to strengthen America's negotiating position, not to terrify the other side into thinking war was coming. The intelligence from Gordievsky changed everything. Reagan was briefed on Soviet fears. He was reportedly shocked to learn that his words had been interpreted as preparation for war. He had been trying to negotiate from strength, not to start a conflict. Able Archer ended on November 11th. It had been scheduled to end that day regardless. But in the following weeks, American policy began to shift. Reagan's rhetoric softened. He spoke more about peace and less about evil empires. Arms control negotiations were prioritized. Direct communication with Soviet leadership increased. The most dangerous moment of the Cold War had passed, and the world had barely noticed. The Able Archer scare had lasting consequences. American intelligence began a major reassessment of Soviet thinking. They had assumed the Soviets were confident and aggressive. Instead, they found fear and insecurity. This changed how they interpreted Soviet behavior. Reagan himself was transformed by the experience. His second term focused heavily on arms control. He met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in a series of summits. The relationship between the superpowers warmed dramatically. The INF Treaty of 1987 eliminated intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe. The very weapons that had caused so much fear were removed. It was a direct result of the changed approach. Operation Ryan continued for several more years, though with diminishing intensity. Gorbachev's reforms and the improving relationship with the West gradually reduced the fear that had driven it. The operation was formally ended in the late 1980s. By then, the Cold War itself was ending. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But the lessons of Ryan remained relevant. The operation showed how intelligence analysis could go wrong, how asking the wrong questions could lead to dangerous conclusions, how fear could become self-reinforcing. What went wrong with Ryan? First, the operation was driven by ideology rather than evidence. Andropov believed the West was hostile before any intelligence was gathered. Ryan was designed to confirm his beliefs, not to test them. Second, the methodology was flawed. Measuring preparation rather than intent guaranteed finding evidence of threat. The indicators chosen would always show activity because military readiness was constant. Third, the operation created pressure on agents to deliver results. When headquarters asks for evidence of attack preparation, agents find it. Reporting nothing risks appearing incompetent. The incentive structure biased the intelligence. Fourth, there was no mechanism for disconfirmation. Ryan asked whether America was prepared to attack. It never asked whether America actually intended to attack. The absence of attack was not treated as evidence against the hypothesis. Fifth, the feedback loop went unrecognized. Soviet responses to perceived threats created American responses that confirmed Soviet fears. Neither side understood the dynamic they were trapped in. These failures are not unique to the Soviet system. They can occur in any intelligence organization, any bureaucracy, any human institution. The tendency to confirm existing beliefs, to see what we expect to see, to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support our fears. These are human tendencies, not communist ones. Ryan was an extreme example. But milder versions happen constantly. What does Operation Ryan teach us? First, that fear can be more dangerous than hostility. Soviet Union in 1983 was not aggressive, it was frightened. And frightened powers can be more dangerous than confident ones. They see threats everywhere. They may strike preemptively out of desperation. Second, that communication matters. The Able Archer crisis occurred because neither side understood the other. NATO did not know the Soviets were terrified. The Soviets did not know NATO was merely exercising. Better communication might have prevented the entire episode. Third, that intelligence can mislead. Ryan produced enormous amounts of information. All of it was accurate. Blood banks really did have certain stock levels. Government buildings really did have lights on. Military bases really did have activity. But the interpretation was completely wrong. Data is not understanding. Fourth, that individual courage matters. Gordievsky's information may have saved the world. One man, risking his life to share what he knew, changed the course of history. Without him, the misunderstanding might have continued until it became catastrophe. Operation Ryan was the product of paranoid leadership, flawed methodology, and institutional dysfunction. It nearly caused the war it was designed to prevent. The missiles are still there. The question of intent still matters. And the possibility of misunderstanding remains. We came close in 1983, closer than almost anyone knew at the time. The wrong question was asked. The wrong answer was found. And the world nearly ended because of it. The lesson is simple. Ask the right questions. Consider alternative explanations. Recognize that fear can distort perception. And remember that the other side is also afraid.